Thank you, Jackie. So in the last presentation, as I sat there and I watched Yvonne Graham's PowerPoint, it took me back to when I was a reporter at New York One, and I spent a week, thank you, I spent a week in a school in Brooklyn where, and we're going back about a decade and a half now, where students were learning in closets, where students had little resources, and it was largely a student population that was low income, many who were immigrant, and from families who were, again, at the low end of the economic scale. And more recently, with one of the programs that I work with right now, I'm regularly visiting a school in Manhattan where I'm seeing the other side of the coin, where there are students who have every type of resource and access available to them. So as I watched this presentation and saw those statistics comparing the high poverty and low education levels in some communities and the reverse in others, it took me back and made me realize how important it is that as we discuss inequality to equality, how important education is. And in this campaign season, as we often hear all the fiery rhetoric, what has troubled me is that we're not talking about, in my view, we're not talking about education. So today's focus on equality couldn't be fully understood without exploring the landscape of education in New York State and New York City. And we often hear about international competitors who are advancing at a much stronger pace than students in our country with better success at narrowing or even closing the achievement gaps. There was a passage in a New York Times column recently that stuck out to me that I'd like to read and have everyone think about as I introduce our panel. Economic inequality still constrains poor children's horizons. Low-income and middle-class parents still struggle to find affordable, high-quality preschools. The elementary, middle, and high schools that rich and poor students attend differ markedly in resources and quality. And it isn't clear that the recent reductions in school readiness gaps will automatically translate into greater equality in high school, college, and beyond. Now, finger pointing often is directed at structural barriers such as inequitable funding systems. One recent survey, in fact, found that 45% of high poverty schools received less state and local funding than was typical for other schools in their districts. So today we ask, if education was once thought to be, quote, the great equalizer, how does the country, and in particular New York State and New York City, fare in our efforts to provide equal opportunity to all of our children? Here to answer that question and much more is our prestigious panel, and thank you, Jackie, for assembling such a good panel. I'd like to start by giving brief bios of each one of our panelists. To my left is Sarah Garland, the executive editor of the Hechinger Report. For those not familiar with the Hechinger Report, it covers inequality and innovation in education through in-depth journalism that uses research, data, and stories from the classroom to show the public how education can be improved and why it matters. Sarah started out in journalism reporting for New York Newsday, the New York Times, and then the New York Sun, where she covered the education beat. As a Spencer Fellow in Education, reporting at Columbia University's Graduate School in Journalism, she wrote Divided We Fail, a narrative of the landmark enactment and repeal of court-ordered school desegregation in her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. She's the author of Gangs in Garden City, about Salvadoran street gangs in the Long Island suburbs. And her first book, The Haunted Kitchen, you know I had to bring this up, her first book was awarded the best entry by a third grader at Coleridge Taylor Elementary School. She was a finalist for the 2011 Deadline Club Award for her Washington Monthly story about the New York City schools, and she's a frequent guest on MSNBC, here on now on WABC, the Diane Rame Show, Rame Show, the Leonard Lopate Show, PBS NewsHour, Bloomberg ED, and Bloomberg EDU. And her pieces at the Hechinger Report have touched on race, testing, standards, charter school education, teacher training, the digital divide, and Common Core. Our second panelist, to Sarah's left, is Dr. Danielle Moss Lee, President and CEO of the YWCA of New York City. Dr. Lee has more than 2.5 decades of experience in education and human services. She started out as a teacher, sorry, I'm dating you though. She started out as a teacher in the Bronx and Brooklyn and later served as president and CEO of the Harlem Educational Activities Fund, an adjunct assistant professor of urban youth policy at City College of New York, director for community and parent partnerships at the After School Corporation, and consulting project director for the Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth. She's the co-founder and lead applicant of the Cicely Walker Children's Academy, Harlem Charter School, which was the first authorized charter school in the state of New York. And she served on a number of boards and been honored for her contributions to education and the social sector. In many of her roles, she's expanded access and opportunities in underserved communities in ways that show integrity, respect, and an eye towards sustainable impact. A few other points about her. She's led the YW since 2012, and during this time, the YW has expanded its program portfolio to include a women's speaker series for professional women, girls' leadership programs, and STEM education, which is extremely important for girls and young women. And she's also increased advocacy for women and girls in the city. Earlier this year, Mayor de Blasio appointed her to the city's Commission on Gender Equity, and as one publication said about Dr. Lee, quote, carrying her lifelong belief that education is the key to getting out of poverty, Dr. Danielle Moss Lee is certainly one of the city's leading ladies when it comes to giving herself to the community. To Dr. Lee's left, we have Rhea Wong. Now, full disclosure, I work with Rhea. I know her well. I'll try not to ask personal questions today, Rhea. Rhea is the executive director of Breakthrough New York. For those not familiar with Breakthrough New York, it's a nonprofit that transforms the lives of talented kids from low-income backgrounds by providing educational support from middle school to and now through college into careers, and inspires talented young people to enter into careers in education through its Students Teaching Students model. The 17-year-old nonprofit's goal is to create leaders who break the cycle of poverty in their families and in their communities. Now, Rhea, her experience began with Breakthrough because she is a Breakthrough graduate herself. She attended the Breakthrough program, then called Summerbridge, in San Francisco, and because of that program, then went on to the Thatcher School and then McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She returned, or rather her professional career with Breakthrough began when she was a Breakthrough Fellow, a teaching fellow, while in high school and then again in college. She taught at Summerbridge sites in Hawaii, Hong Kong, and New York, and was the first ever teaching fellow there, hired at Breakthrough New York in 1999. After college graduation, she stayed in the Breakthrough family and worked at the Breakthrough Collaborative National Office in San Francisco and created its first on-campus recruiter program. Since she began as Breakthrough New York's executive director more than a decade ago, we're at 11 years now, congratulations, she's launched 2 new sites in Brooklyn and the Bronx where there was a steep demand for Breakthrough services. She's grown its staff and services, increased her operating budget by 800%, and now recruits about 100 new students a year into the program. She's become a voice for education policies at the local, citywide, and national levels, and she credits the Breakthrough program for putting her on a path to success and is deeply passionate about giving back. Our final panelist today is Dr. Gail Mellow, president of LaGuardia Community College. For the last 16 years, Dr. Mellow has served as president of LaGuardia, which is a nationally recognized leader among community colleges with 50,000 students from more than 150 countries, and many of them are foreign-born, and many of them are first-generation college-goers. As an expert on history and the development and future of the American Community College, she's co-authored Minding the Dream, the Process and Practice of the American Community College, and the new book, Taking College Teaching Seriously. She is frequently sought out as a commentator on the changing landscape of higher education, strategies for improving our nation's graduation rate, and the important role that community colleges play in growing America's middle class and strengthening the economy. Earlier this year, she was selected to receive the 2016 NASPA President's Award, which recognizes higher education leaders who advance the quality of student life on campus. And earlier this month, she was nominated by President Obama to serve as a member of the National Council on the Humanities. She is a staunch believer in community colleges and in fact, is a graduate of Jamestown Community College before she went on to earn her PhD. As she says, quote, "Community colleges are a uniquely American institution. They open the doors of higher education to all, create economic opportunity, and strengthen our democracy." Thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your perspective. I'd like to start with Sarah. Sarah, in one opinion piece that you had written last year, you explored desegregation. You had said in that piece, quote, "Why isn't more being done to bring students of different races together in the most racially and ethnically diverse city in the country, one where the public schools have had little success closing a huge racial achievement gap?" Let's try this.
I can go stand.
There you go.
All right, we'll do this. Okay. So I'm going to talk about that problem. I think it's the root of a lot of the biggest problems that the New York City public schools face. And as the journalist, I'll sort of talk problems, and then from there, I hope we can get into the solutions with the other panelists, although we at Hechinger really believe in solutions-oriented journalism, so I have some ideas around that. But I think to frame the discussion, I want to talk about what I think is wrong. And I'm actually going to tell you a story about Mississippi, which I promise is relevant, so bear with me. But Hechinger has an ongoing interest in Mississippi, where we've been looking at inequality and the legacy of segregation there and how that's adversely affected schools. We figure if problems can be fixed there in the schools, they can be fixed anywhere. And we've looked a lot at, especially the Delta, where most white students attend private segregation academies, as they're called. Most black students are in crumbling public school buildings where there aren't enough books. Teachers leave, regularly. And we've placed a reporting intern there who is from Mississippi. She's an African-American student who went to public school there in a quickly changing suburb. And last spring, we invited her up to New York to come visit with us, do some reporting in our offices. And while she was here, I decided to give her an assignment to go out and report. I thought it would be interesting for her to dip a toe in New York City in the school politics here, and figured it would probably feel like visiting a foreign country after spending her life in Mississippi and reporting in the Deep South. She went to a meeting at a local public school, and she came back to the office and said, "Wow, New York is just like home." She had been attending a meeting about a zoning battle over overcrowding in the mostly white and Asian PS 199. If any of you live on the Upper West Side, then you may be familiar with this fight. The idea was to send some of the kids in this highly oversubscribed school to a nearby, nearly all black and Hispanic school that sat right next to a housing project. They were very close together, but in terms of the demographics of the schools, very, very different. As you can imagine and maybe guess, the parents at PS 199 were not happy about the idea of sending some of their kids and merging with this other school. So the Department of Education came up with another idea. They decided that they would, instead of trying to merge student bodies, send a little school that was sharing space with the Anderson School, which, if you've heard of that, is one of the most prestigious, gifted public schools in the city. They were going to move them into the old building next to the projects, and sort of a musical chairs thing happening, and then give PS 192, which was the mostly black and Hispanic school, its own building. That didn't make the parents at PS 145 happy either. And Sierra, our intern, went to the meeting where they were discussing this plan with the schools. And even though the parents, the teachers and the principals were happy at the chance to get a bigger school, all their own, the mostly white and Asian middle-class parents didn't want to walk the extra distance. That was sort of the focal point of their argument. And Sierra came back, and she had read more into it. in her eyes, where she's been trained in the more overt fights over race in the schools in Mississippi, she saw the issues about space and distance as proxies for racial discomfort and prejudice. And as she put it in a piece that she filed to me, it was about parents having, as she put it, chosen their community, and they were fighting to stay there. While she was here, she also visited PS 192, which was the mostly Black and Hispanic school by the projects. It had been labeled a persistently dangerous school, but when she walked in, wandered around, people welcomed her. It was a very friendly place. The faces looked just like hers. And by the end of the week, she wrote in her story, America's sins against the impoverished, especially of color, are not Mississippi's alone. And I think for many of you, it may not be too off base to hear New York City compared to the deep, deep South. But, if you've been reading the news, you may have seen the recent story by Nicole Hannah-Jones about her decision to send her child to a segregated school. And you may even be familiar with the research that's found New York City to be one of the most segregated school systems in the country. What we've recently heard is that the universal pre-K program, which has been really a success here, also turns out to be even more segregated racially than the public schools themselves. And when we were talking, the reason I'm talking about this issue is because I see it as a very fundamental problem, and it came up when we were discussing how to frame this panel a couple of weeks ago with Jackie. She was talking about how there seems to be this dual system here in New York City, and in fact, maybe even a 4 or 5 tier system. You have the private schools, the Daltons and the Trinities. You have the specialized and gifted schools like Stuyvesant and Anderson. At Stuyvesant, for example, a few years ago, there was only 7 or 8 Black students in the entering freshman class. Then you have the charter schools, the schools that the parents with means, the parochial schools, opt into if they can figure out how to navigate the system. And then there are the schools for everybody else who don't have the parents who can figure out how to navigate the system and make a choice to find a better school. And in some cases, these schools do better than expected. But in a lot of cases, they are not able to help students overcome the level of challenges that they come to school with. And they tend to have the lowest test scores, the biggest teacher turnover rates, and the fewest resources. They don't have the PTAs raising money for extra teacher aides. They don't have principals writing grant applications for art programs. And that's why the extreme levels of segregation in New York City matter. The graduation rate here is actually at an all-time high. It reached 70% recently, but the gap is still very, very wide. So 85% of Asian students and 82% of white students graduate on time, 65% of Black students and 64% of Hispanic students graduate on time. And I'm sure Dr. Mellow will talk about this. Less than half of them are reaching college readiness benchmarks. As a longtime African-American educator once put it to me, green follows white. The research has found that integrating students can improve outcomes, especially long-term outcomes for students of color, and that it doesn't hurt white children and can even reduce their prejudices. Looking locally, the Bloomberg administration did a study about 10 years ago as they were trying to figure out how to improve graduation rates. And what they found in the study is that for kids at risk of dropping out, attending a small school helped their chances. The other thing, you've probably heard of the small schools movement, and that's really what they latched on to. What also helped their chances was attending a school where they were not as concentrated, where you had smaller concentrations of at-risk students, which is something that often correlates with race and class in this city. So the question, I think, is why has the city not, and this is the question I asked in this article, why has the city not tried to deal with the level of segregation in a more systemic way? And how is it possible for a city with such a progressive reputation to have a segregation problem as bad as the Deep South, as Mississippi, which is a state that just voted to keep the Confederate flag on its state flag? And I think there's a few reasons, and I think we can talk about some progress as well. One is just the logistics. I think, it's also a very big place, and while we may be very diverse, that diversity is spread across a large geographic area. There are opportunities like on the Upper West Side and neighborhoods like mine in Brooklyn that are seeing diversity come in, and where you may have an opportunity to deal with gentrification. But you also have some of the same similarities that you face in the very rural Mississippi Delta, where you have isolated islands of poverty that are surrounded by other neighborhoods, in Brownsville or in the Bronx, where getting to prosperity in an economically advantaged neighborhood is hard, even on the subway. It's a distance that parents aren't always willing to make. And the other huge obstacle that I don't know that we talk about a lot is to have a diverse and maintain a diverse district. You need to keep the middle class, white and Asian families in the district. And this is something that cities, unlike New York, but places like Detroit and elsewhere have struggled with, is white flight. And how do you keep upper middle class families happy? And, you think if the Department of Education probably is very aware of the benefits of integration, I think they're also very aware that if they had proposed merging PS 199 and PS 192, PS 199 parents, a lot of them might have said, well, off we go to New Jersey. So I think that there's incentive. Creating incentives for families to stay here is an imperative, and it's very difficult to figure out how to do that while sort of trying to get at the benefits of integration. That said, and I'll finish with a little bit of hope, dismantling the separate school system here in New York is not necessarily a lost cause. There's a tiny, tiny group of schools that's elected to set aside seats for low-income students to maintain diversity. So you have some parents who are opting in, saying, we want our schools to be diverse, this matters. And you actually, on the Upper West Side, have a group of parents who propose the idea of controlled choice, where choice in and of itself tends to exacerbate segregation. If people just have the free choices in their kids wherever, that tends to correlate with increases in demographically homogeneous schools. But when you control that choice and you say, you can choose among these schools, but we're going to put a finger on the scale to make sure those schools stay diverse, that can make a difference. And places like my hometown in Louisville have tried that. And that's a proposal that's been floated in on the Upper West Side. And you also have a federal Department of Education that's talking now about incentivizing desegregation. So there's some hope. It's a steep road to climb, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists about some of the other solutions and what we can do to improve outcomes across the board for poor children and children of color in this deeply divided city. Thank you. Yeah.
So Dr. Danielle Moss Lee, you're a leader in the nonprofit community, so I'm curious to hear your perspective on the role that nonprofits play in the arena of educational support.
Is this working? So thank you for having me to the Women's City Club and your illustrious CEO. I'm glad to be here. As you were talking, I was a little saddened because I actually sat on the Community Education Council in District 3 when this issue about PS 199 first came up. And I'm a native Upper West Sider, and we always like to think of ourselves as incredibly liberal and inclusive as a community. And the contention that I experienced during my tenure would seem to suggest that we do more lip service than actual work in that area. So I think it's hard to really do a deep dive around school integration when we don't have housing integration, whether you're in New York City or in outer borough communities. One of the things that working at the YW has served to remind me of is how isolating poverty is. And I will tell you, earlier in my career, I worked as a teacher in Bed-Stuy before it was the place to go. And you know, because gentrification brings a whole different set of issues. And we had an auditorium of middle school students, 12 to 14, in a room similar in size to this one. And there were about 200 kids in the room. And one of my colleagues asked the kids, how many of you have ever been to like downtown Brooklyn? And I was stunned at how few of my students had even felt they had the permission to go from Bed-Stuy to downtown Brooklyn. And then we said, how many of you guys have left the borough of Brooklyn and actually been to Manhattan? And the number of students who'd actually been to Manhattan dropped, right? And I always thought of the city as incredibly accessible because of our broad transportation system. But we have a way of communicating to young people and not so young people who belongs where. It's incredibly limiting. So low-income students who live in segregated communities often don't even feel like they have permission to venture out of their immediate surroundings. At the YWCA, a lot of our programs happen in East New York, Brownsville, and Coney Island. There's one train station that goes to Coney Island. And so logistically, to even get our kids to attend tours in terms of higher education, it's a real challenge. So we like to talk about education as this panacea for everything that happens in communities. But if we're not willing to look at income inequality, I like to say to women's groups all the time, we talk about this 77 cents on the dollar that women are earning, but that does not apply to me as a Black woman. We're closer to 64 cents on the dollar, and my Latina sisters are closer to 56, 57 cents on the dollar. And so a lot of what makes education rich and meaningful is not even necessarily the reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it's all the hidden curriculum, we like to call it, right? So access to arts institutions, access to athletic facilities and activities and structured sports, access to music. I grew up on 97th and Columbus, and I got to have music lessons at Bloomingdale House of Music, and my mother was really diligent and well-resourced in terms of giving me exposure. I took Saturday classes at the Museum of Natural History, right? And that was all supplementing the curriculum that I got in the school day. And so I think this is the role that nonprofits have to play. We cannot replace what you haven't done for 7 hours of a school day in 3 hours after school when the kids are tired and hungry, right? But we can provide the emotional, social, and enrichment support that I think help to make kids more well-rounded. The challenge with the specialized high schools, I just had this conversation with someone, I think maybe 8 of the freshman class at Brooklyn Tech were African-American students. So a couple of things have contributed to this intensive segregation at the highest performing schools, right? So we know going into the gate that low-income students have less access to quality math and science teachers. Some middle schools are not even offering more rigorous coursework to their kids. So you may have a lot of bright, talented students who, if they had a teacher who could teach that subject, would probably thrive at some of our more rigorous high schools, and they don't even have access to the content to be able to compete. The other thing is this is a test-driven system. So people are always surprised when I say, you could be a failing student and get into Stuyvesant if you know how to take a test. But you also could be an A student who performs consistently over time and be told that you don't have access to that test. And the testing requirements go up almost every year, right? And most students in low-income communities are not told that if you don't gain admission as an 8th grader, you have a right and the opportunity to take that test again as a 9th grader and try to get in. So how we share information, I think, also kind of contributes to the larger problem. And I think in my career in the nonprofit sector, that's how I've seen my work, to be the bridge between what institutions make available to families, what we know is actually available to families, and to help to kind of bridge all of that together. The young people who are taking our STEM classes, for the most part, don't have access to robotics and the other kinds of things that we're doing with young people. So, you know, it hasn't happened because we as New Yorkers don't want it to happen. And I think we also have to acknowledge that as well.
It's interesting because as you spoke, I thought of how the New York City Mission Society spent its time this summer with all of its students in its summer camp program. They went around the world in 30 days and took students to all areas of New York City where they had never been before. One trip just even across the Brooklyn Bridge and back was amazing for these kids because they had never experienced this. Our next speaker is Rhea Wong. Now, Rhea, I've come to know your program and a lot of your kids, and it's really interesting to watch their trajectory. So can you tell us a little about your program, the lessons learned, and some of the challenges that these students have faced?
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues and amongst you. You'll forgive me, I have a little bit of a cough that I'm getting over. Speaking of that last panel, I was like, I need access to health, actually. But Breakthrough New York is what we call a college success program. So we originally started off as strictly a middle school program, which and we're very devoted to middle school students because for those of you who either are parents or family members of or have at one time been a middle school student, you're not unaware of the fact that it is an incredibly tumultuous time in a young person's life. And particularly as Danielle suggested in this, is that better? Okay. Usually speaking loud is not my problem. So because we're devoted to middle school, given the trajectory of where you end up in high school largely determines whether or not you are ready to go to college or going to go to college, we felt that the intervention in the middle school years was critical. Over time, we've actually expanded our services to support our kids through the high school years and 3 years ago through college because of the fact that most of our children are first-generation college goers. And I think we made assumptions about, well, if you get into a great college, you'll be fine. Unsurprisingly, they weren't fine. We had about a 50% dropout rate. And the challenges that we're facing our kids were academic, financial, social, and emotional in nature. And so we're learning a lot about what it takes to support first-generation kids to and through college. We also have given ourselves a bit of a mandate around career readiness because our mission is really about breaking cycles of poverty. And as we know, certainly having a college degree is important, but also having a job that pays you a livable wage is also equally as important. And so what is interesting to us is as our children are going into elite institutions in this country, there is, as Danielle mentioned, the whole hidden curriculum about access to the best jobs and the best networks. And did you know, by the way, that you're not going to get an internship at Goldman Sachs unless you start working on it freshman year? Our kids don't know that. So there's another story that I wanted to share, which I think speaks to a lot of the way that we think about the work. So early on in my career, I worked out of a private school on the Upper East Side. That's actually where our original program was housed. And I was sharing an office with Mrs. Herschel, the math teacher. And I'm sitting there minding my own business, emailing away. And one of the students who attended the school came into the office. He's a 5th grader. He sits down next to Mrs. Herschel and goes, "Mrs. Herschel, you gave me a B- on this math quiz, but actually I deserve a B+. And he went through this whole negotiation about his grade. Like, well, I didn't get the right answer, but you can see here that I was on my way and I did the right steps. I mean, he negotiated his way into a B+. And I was sitting there like, I didn't even know that was an option. Like, are you kidding me? At that point, I was in my 20s, and it never occurred to me to negotiate with a teacher over a grade. And what I found instructive about that particular lesson is this 5th grader, this 10-year-old kid, had figured out enough about his access to power and his entitlement, for lack of a better term, about what he deserved and what he was willing to go and ask for. And our kids, to a lot of the points that are made here, are very disempowered. They live in communities where they feel like they have to ask permission to get what they deserve. And so a lot of the work that we do, it's certainly academic in nature, but I also think of it as character building and changing the mindsets of our kids and our families. So we're very intentional about where we put our programs. So we actually have a program on the Upper East Side, though obviously none of our children live on the Upper East Side. We have a program in the South Bronx, but it's at the Carrie Leeds Tennis Center, where our kids also get free tennis lessons, and we're in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and many of our kids in Brooklyn come from East New York and Bed-Stuy. And so what's interesting about this is this notion of crossing boundaries and the fact that they are going to neighborhoods that they're not used to, and they start to feel comfortable, certainly not at first, but they feel comfortable in walking into neighborhoods where they don't see people who look like them. And we take them on trips to boarding schools in New England, and we take them onto the leafy, beautiful campuses of Horace Mann and Dalton and Riverdale. And we start to show them what is possible for them. And, in as much as I think there are obviously very real financial constraints around poverty and access to resources and access to information, I also think there is a failure of imagination and what's possible if you've never seen what's possible. Like, if you have no idea what you're capable of, if nobody that you know has ever gone to college, how do you know that you can go to college? And what does that look like? Because frankly, for the folks who maybe have gone to college, like they don't necessarily live in the communities where our children grow up. One other thing that I wanted to talk about was this notion of community and tribe. So I've been executive director for 11 years, and I think over time, I used to think a lot about educational theory, and I read the white papers, and I, read all the latest studies from all of the different think tanks around education, and it's all obviously incredibly important. But I think I've gotten much more simple in my thinking about the work, which I think it's about relationships, and it's about creating communities around our kids. And so we're very intentional about accepting kids into the program that represent the diversity of New York. And again, I didn't grow up in New York. I actually grew up in San Francisco. And I was surprised at how segregated the educational system was in New York. And I would meet kids who, one of my African-American kids from Brooklyn had never met a Chinese kid who grew up in Chinatown, who'd never met a Latino kid growing up in Williamsburg. It was like, it's not that far. This is the same city. And so we're very intentional about, within our program, accepting kids, and it is a selective process, but we take kids and specifically we mix them up and we do things like Diversity Day, so that they are exposed to this concept of like, there are other kids out there, and we are all of us New Yorkers. I call myself a New Yorker after 10 years. And what's important about who they are is that they create a tribe amongst themselves to help lift themselves up to and through college. And we talk a lot about us being a family. I mean, obviously they have their families, and their families are part of our family, but the kids create a family unto themselves where they develop their own cultural norms around access and community and caring about college, and supporting each other through these incredibly tough challenges and these inflection points in their lives of being the first in their families to go to college, or being the first in their families to go to a Stuyvesant or any sort of school. So I think my time is up. Thank you so much.
And what's so interesting is that having met a lot of these students in Breakthrough as they first start the program and then kind of following some of them through the trajectory, it's interesting when you ask them, you sit down and you say, how have you changed? What's different? And nearly every one of them says that they learned to speak for themselves. They speak up more. And it's just an amazing transition. So congratulations. Our final speaker, Dr. Gail Mellow. Now, I looked at your website, and I pulled a line from something that you say in the president's letter there that I thought we could use as a springboard for your discussion. You say, quote, "We need to have a different conversation about a new standard in American education. I want to change it so that we're making a much deeper commitment to what most people need to succeed." Tell us about that.
Well, thank you, and it's just great to be here in this incredible space with this incredible group of women. Thank you so much for having me here to celebrate your 100th birthday. May we all be around for the 200th, right? So you have to understand that there are like advocates, then there are missionaries, and then there are like hair on fire missionaries, and I'm like at that end, so you got to hear everything I say through that lens, right? And I want to talk about higher education and our misperception of it and the inequality that is increasingly becoming the American way of higher education. So one of the pieces that you need to understand is that most undergraduate, more than 50% of the undergraduates in the United States go to community colleges. If you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you would think everyone was 19 and being driven to campus to live on campus, right? The modal age of a college student in the United States is 25. 25. Most students connect education with work. So that we have to rethink who's in college. In particular, when you look at community college students, you also have to look at what do those students look like. Most low-income students, most students of color, and most women are going to be at a community college. You need to understand that's where America educates the bottom 60% in a socioeconomic status. A community college, unlike a Princeton, doesn't take the top 1% or even the top 20%. We take the top 100%. And that's really a disruptive technology that is so American and so important, and why investing in community colleges is so critical. But community colleges here in New York City, in New York State, and throughout the country get about 30 cents to the dollar of four-year public colleges. Don't even get me started on the private colleges, but the four-year public colleges get 2/3 more. And so we have to ask, is that because of who we educate? I'll leave the answer up to you, but part of it is that were we, as the United States, were community colleges a K-12 system, we would have the best case to litigate on separate and not equal that has ever been seen in the United States. So we have to understand, you have to follow the money. And that's as true if we're educating students at Stuyvesant or Dalton, my God, as it is looking at what's happening in higher education. So one of the pieces that's so exciting for me is to understand what little bits of investment can do. And I want to tell you, I'm a storyteller because our students' lives are so exciting. And you heard that at LaGuardia, if you want to see what the positive part of the future of the world is, please come. And I invite you all to come. I'd love to have you. What you see is that when you live in a place where 2/3 of the students weren't born in the United States, they speak 110 different languages, they come from 160 different countries, there's no minority and there's no majority, the vitality sort of pops. It's like very exciting. And that's the positive side that in the xenophobic times, we hear so much that is ugly and hateful. and we don't lift up, and I hope you will lift up how powerful it is to bring in individuals from around the world. Thanks. Help me do this. So I'll tell you 3 quick stories. One is that I'm in a room with a potential funder, and you know college presidents love potential funders, and I have a couple of students, and I just say, tell your story, because you know, they warts and all, they've got to understand what it's like to go to LaGuardia Community College. And this one young woman starts talking, and she says, I'm from Azerbaijan, and when I was bride napped, and she goes on, I'm like, wait a minute. I don't know what those words mean. What is bride napped? She said, oh, President Mellow, you do know. It's like kidnapped, only they kidnap you to be their bride, and luckily the man who kidnapped me knew me, so he didn't rape me, so I wasn't damaged goods, and I actually could go back to my parents' house. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, she's in like Introduction to Calculus and English 101, in the back of her mind thinking, if you send me back to Azerbaijan, what will happen? This student now has a full scholarship at Smith and is going to be the best, we're going to send her to Hechinger, she's going to be the best international journalist on women's rights. It's extraordinary. Another student, she was our valedictorian, grew up in Trinidad, Tobago. Her mother went to the United States, left her there with her family members, and basically this young woman homeschooled herself and her brother, went through times when they didn't have electricity. So it felt like, you know, thinking of 100 years ago, right? Somebody at the start of the New York City Women's Club, she created her own business there. She figured out she could, if I redo cell phones, I can sell them again. She made it to the United States. Her mom actually was then able to get her in. She was working in a summer youth employment program at LaGuardia when somebody looked at her and was like, wow, are you smart? This young woman, again, our valedictorian, just got a full scholarship to Emory. She's going to run AT&T and Verizon soon. She's going to be amazing. And the last one, and it relates to, I think, what my colleague Danielle was talking about or maybe it was you, I forgot who, about imagining yourself, being able to see yourself. So one of our students grew up single. He had only son of a single mom, grew up in the Bronx. He was a janitor, helping his mom get by. When he realized, like, I'm never going to get where I need to be. What can I do? He went to LaGuardia Community College only because he figured out the subway, and it was closer for him to go there than anywhere else, right? It's all about practical things for our students. And so Brian came, and again, brilliant. Brian Rodriguez, you're going to hear his name. And I put these students with me, I bring them with me, and he came up to me after an event where we teach them to do things like shake hands and look somebody in the eye and tell them your story. You know, that's what networking is. They've got to know how to do that. They never had to do that in their communities, but they have to do it to succeed in New York City. And he came up and he said, President Mellow, this was just the best thing. I said, oh, come on, Brian, tell me why. And he said, because I've always had dreams. You know I've always had dreams, but now I can see myself in those dreams. And he now is on a full scholarship to Columbia in finance. These are amazing people. These are extraordinary resources that because of funding structures, we throw away. We throw away the talent that we have that is unequaled anyplace else. The world needs our understanding of the system of higher education, from pre-K through me, because 80% of my students come needing developmental education. They have high school diplomas or a GED, but they're reading at the 7th grade level. And you know what? Yes, I would love it if New York City public schools got better, but I welcome those students because it is so American to say, I'm not throwing you away. I'm not throwing you away because you grew up in Bed-Stuy. And one student said to me, well, you know, I was making money on the streets. Don't ask me how I was making money. I'm like, Okay, I want you to stop that. I want you to be an accountant. I want you to get your GED. I want you to make a difference. And that's what we have to do. These are not disposable human beings. And what we have in terms of this intellectual power, the ability to show the world what it's like, not to integrate sort of black-white, but to integrate the world. Think of what it would be like if we were able to do that. And so you don't need a crystal ball to see the positive future of the world. You just need to come to LaGuardia Community College.
So, Dr. Mellow, you said we throw away talent, and that's the first thing I'd like to have the panel discuss. So what would you say are some of the conditions that would help to retain and support that talent? Oh, to the whole panel.
Well, I'm part of a movement to eliminate this idea of grit, because grit. I'm anti-grit. So there is a school of thought that says if low-income, disenfranchised students just tough it out, the doors will welcome them. And like Rhea, I've worked in organizations where we're not just concerned with getting kids into college, but making sure that they persist. And I think part of our responsibility around that is to be real with each other about the fact that the 10-year-old black boy who goes into his math teacher to say, I want you to change my grade, may have a very different experience. And so how do we have more of those conversations? Because, you know, our kids are not always going to be welcomed into institutions, into organizations. It's not a level playing field. But the positive side of that is we have the power to make it one. But I think it's almost disingenuous to say, you know, we're going to send kids off to XYZ institution and prepare them for a world that, you know, if we watch the news, we realize may not be ready to receive them in the way that we want them to be received. I now have the privilege of sitting on the board of my own alma mater, who is, you know, one of those high-priced private schools where, you know, even if you're paying the full $60,000, we're still, it actually costs $90,000 to go there. So a number of the full-paying students were shocked that you're actually also on financial aid. But that's a whole other conversation about the cost of higher education and how you can you know, kind of hold sacred the intellectual rigor that all of us kind of imagine when we think about a residential four-year school, and the reality of what the economy and most parents and families can sustain. So I think, you know, in as much as we want to integrate institutions and organizations of learning, and we want our kids to be tough, you know, I used to do role plays with my incoming college students. You know, what are you going to do when your roommate wants to run their fingers through your hair and you don't feel comfortable with that? But, like, these are real instances, right? And we'd have the current college students come back and do these scenarios with students. You know, what are you going to do if your roommate questions whether or not you really earned that higher grade that you received on a paper that you both did? Are those kinds of microaggressions going to be the reason that you don't persist? Or are you going to find your tribe and find campus-based support so that you can kind of maneuver around these situations? You know, I come from, I'm a fourth-generation college graduate, so I always assume that everybody is happy to see me. And even at this stage in my career, I'm still negotiating gender and race, and I think that's something, this is a women's audience, we can all relate to, right? I like to tell people when I talk about the work of the YWCA, like the woman part doesn't expire, so we tend to treat women as though it's really focused around your reproductive years. But, you know, I guess I'm going to be wearing this suit till the day I die, right? So I'll always be kind of negotiating issues around gender and race. And we are a society in flux and in transition. I had a college friend who actually was teaching not too far from here in the Upper East Side private school, and she decided on her lunch break to go buy some shampoo and conditioner, and was told immediately by a salesperson, I don't think we sell anything for your hair. And she said, oh, don't worry, I use Pantene, so I think I'm good. But, our young people are not necessarily wired to kind of deal with that. Many years ago, I took a group of kids to Northern Ireland, and there are all these peace walls around Belfast. And the kids said, you know what, we have peace walls in New York City, but they're invisible. And that's something that we should be paying attention to.
I just want to jump onto that idea of grit, because I think it's a really interesting point. And I think that's one of the problems with segregation and how segregated the school system is, that kids don't have access to resources and the teachers they need, and they don't have, we've talked about, access to the information and the networks that they also need to get ahead. And there are different ways to deal with that. You don't just have to desegregate the schools, and I think we've talked about different ways of dealing with that. But, I'll tell a story about a student I've been following for a while. And he was formerly homeless student who has a lot of grit because he went through that, right, with his family. And this is one of the points that one of our columnists made, is that kids of color living in poverty, they have grit. They've dealt with some really hard times, many of them dealt with trauma. That's not the problem. It's giving them access to this sort of information and the horizon that they can see themselves moving beyond where they are to a successful place. So this student I've been following was having a really rough time, bad grades in school, and joined this program, I think partly because he wanted to have a weekend away from dealing with, sleeping on couches and so on. Went to Amherst with College Summit and spent a weekend at Amherst, and just came back transformed, that this is a place I could go. And started this group in his high school, really became a leader of this College Summit group, where they were basically acting as their own guidance counselors, educating themselves about what do you need to do to apply to college, and then teaching other kids around them and creating this community, we're going to college. And I spent time with them this summer at SUNY Albany, and they have this program where it's not about here's how to be gritty and tough. These are kids who are gritty and tough. They've dealt with a lot. But it was giving them information. If you sit in the front row, those are the kids who get good grades. And so every single kid was sitting. It was not like this auditorium. If it were those kids, they'd be all right, y'all be right here, getting an A or a B, right? Sitting up there raising their hands. Just very intensive preparation, just giving them the information they needed to know to act, that all of the other kids already kind of come in inherently having absorbed in their higher resourced, better networked schools and family lives. And they're sort of handing that information over very explicitly. And it was really fascinating to watch these kids, because they were so energized and so motivated. And some of them didn't have pillows because they couldn't afford their parents hadn't thought of that you're going to need to have a pillow at school, and so we're sleeping with balled up sweatshirts. But they all were just so on it and getting this information. So I think thinking about how do we deal with the problem of segregation is not, well, it's impossible. I think it's difficult, but I think there's ways of getting that information, getting the access to those networks, getting those resources to kids. That are possible.
Okay, we're going to start questions in just a moment. Rhea, did you want to add a brief comment?
Yeah, I just have 3 very quick comments. I 100% agree about this notion of grit, and it was summarized for me really nicely in a headline, which is we don't need kids of color to be more gritty. We need schools to be less racist. And I was that's a great headline. The second point is, and this is sort of what we've alluded to, but it's so hard to talk about the issue of education without talking about issues of housing and issues of poverty and issues of race and issues of class and issues of health and nutrition and prenatal care, and like once you start to unravel the ball, it's impossible to kind of disentangle any one thread because it's all connected. And then the third point, and I know this isn't necessarily a conversation about college success and college access, but I think so often we leave families out of the conversation. And we put so much on the kids to be the ones to bear the burden of all of the decisions about college, and yet, like, you live in your family. These are the people who love you and house you and put clothes on your body. And so what are we doing as a sector to help bring the families into the process? And so often, for example, when we have kids that we send away to school, like I actually have one kid at SUNY Albany, and his mom came to a meeting. We started a parents association. We had a meeting, and Anna said, well, we made all this favorite food, we packed the car up, and we drove it up to Albany. And I was like, well, was it Parents Weekend? It's like, yeah, it was Parents Weekend, but we're doing it again next weekend. And I was like, oh no, why are you packing the car up? So often, they do have food in Albany. He has a meal card. And she broke down in tears, and then we had to have a whole other conversation because nothing in her experience and nobody in her family or her community could tell her what it was like for a kid to go away to college. And I think if we ignore the fact that it's not just kids we're serving families, then it's a big piece of the equation we're missing out on.
So we have a question in the back.
Yes. I have two questions, and I would like any members of the panel to address them. One, there has been much talk about the need or efforts about integrating black and white students within the school systems. I think that there needs to be some discussion about the integration of upper middle class black families and poorer black families and poorer minority families. Secondly, something that I don't hear discussed is that historically we have had students exposed to teachers who were often the best and the brightest of their groups, namely women and people of color, because they had no other place to go. Those circumstances have changed. What are we doing to attempt to address that change and that void? Thank you.
Can I take a first stab at that? I think the two issues that you just identified, which is that in our world, we have to understand that class is a very important piece, and class is not uniformly one color. In New York City or in any place else is very important. And then cutting across that is because of efforts from many of the women in this room, and I hope I'm one of them, we fought really hard to allow women to have access to other kinds of careers, and that's great, and then suddenly the great teachers were gone. And those are the unintended consequences, right, of terrific things that are going on. So I think asking that question in and of itself is a really important piece. I think the issues of class are undeniably important in the United States, and I think we have to talk about them. What you hear in the political rhetoric is it's sort of bizarre to me that all of a sudden all poor people are white men. Have you heard that? Like, that's what it feels like to me. Like, all of a sudden all poor people are white men. It's like, really? It's just... So part of it is, I think, as an advocacy organization as you are, that bringing up these issues is really, really important. And the other piece I'll go back to is funding, so that you are not going to get the best and brightest in education if education remains two things. I would say not just a low-paid job, but also a reviled job. Teachers used to be held up as the center of our communities. And now if I hear it once, I hear it a million times, when I talk to corporate people, really you can almost hear them spit when they talk about teachers, as if teachers are craven, horrible, unintellectual people. And I think we together have to say, you know what, first of all, most of the teachers are still women. And so you have to see that as race and gender, but also to really change the dialogue and the discussion about teaching.
I just wanted to thank you for raising the question around class, because I think largely Americans still see Black folks as monolithic. And so there's not a real perception that we have different backgrounds, come from different experiences. And I think on the other side, we as a community have not really tackled this issue of class and mutual support, because I think middle class Black folks, the social capital that they are able to leverage depends on one's ability to distance oneself and to distinguish oneself from communities that have a more, negative narrative. As someone whose family, roots are partly in the Caribbean, in Barbados and Antigua, if you come from the Caribbean, you know that, we also play that game in terms of, oh, I'm not Black, I'm whatever, insert. And of course, my white colleagues are looking like, really? Like, 'cause y'all look the same to me. So I think there's definitely room to have a larger conversation about that. People, every time I say I'm a fourth generation college graduate, that's, really stunning to a lot of people.
I would just jump in and say that one thing that doesn't necessarily help is the language around in education reform especially, but also just around poverty is helping people get out. And I think that's been discussion about like how do we help people escape, and that translates into thinking about escaping their people escaping your community. And so talking about education reform, I think in the last panel they talked about working with communities to make change is important. But I just want to also plug a 3-part series that I'm in the middle of editing right now about minority teachers in particular, and how to, one, looking at the problems and why places like New Orleans have seen huge decreases in the number of, the percentage of Black teachers in the school district that's overwhelmingly Black. And then some solutions around, some places that are trying some new things to bring in more Hispanic and, more immigrant and more African-American teachers into the profession. One of the issues is not that the number of minority teachers is actually growing. One of the problems is that they leave faster. So looking at why and how to deal with that.
So really briefly, one thing that we're doing at Breakthrough, and it's a drop in a very large ocean, is we have what we call a students teaching students model. So we're recruiting kids at top college campuses around the country to teach in our summer internship. And over 90% of our teaching alumni go on to professional careers in education. About 70% of our teachers last year identified as a minority, and 50% were men. So they're small numbers, but we're hopeful that this is a trend that continues to grow. I think the other piece of the other side of the coin is how to retain them once they enter careers in education.
Something that is running through all of these presentations, and I think was picked up in your comment, those of us who are close to or who have been close to the communities in Manhattan could sense that there's something missing, and that was the idea of the old settlement house that provided a connection between kids wherever they were in their development and how they needed to be, and provided role models and provided imagination. And so I think that where something like that doesn't exist, we need to hypothesize it. And it may be the YWCA in some communities, but those linkages need to be done. It's something. I think you can think structurally and behaviorally about it. And it might be a different institution in different places. But I think we need those linkages. And it needs to be an urban phenomenon that we understand.
Any response? Or we all agree? Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
If I could just address the one thing, I'm trying to simplify things in my life, but I think fundamentally, in my mind, that where we are today is because we really stopped thinking of other people's children as our children.
Well,
We don't think of other people's children as our children.
So I think that there are a number of issues, particularly when it comes to Black communities where our children are seen as sources of revenue and slave labor for the prison industrial complex. So I think that a lot of this is by design in terms of the lack of funding for our schools, the poor quality of instruction in our schools, and so when we look at competing interests, is there really truly a desire to move Black children, Black people out of poverty when there are communities within New York State and other states that depend upon our youth for their communities to prosper, and for these prisons where our men and women are providing labor and goods for corporations that are traded publicly, and there is really not much that's being done as a country to address these issues. So that's one point that I want to talk about, because if we really want to affect policy, we need to really start dealing with the way capitalism is utilized in this country and how it impacts people. We're not really concerned, as you said, about all children, all of the talent that could be brought forth to bear, because we are tribal in our thinking and we think about ourselves. Liberals are not progressive when it comes to their children. They are very conservative. Most people are very conservative when it comes to their children. So why would they be interested? Why would any parent who has any knowledge about true excellence in education want to send their child to a school where there are teachers who cannot teach and principals who cannot lead?
And I need to only cut you off only because we have only about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure we end on a hopeful note. So we've talked about a number of issues: access, diversity, grit, which I just downloaded a book, so now I'm going to look at it through a different prism. Give us some hope.
Because he went to Riverdale Country Day School, so.
Give us some hope. What's on the horizon? What is next to try that you think is going to help try to narrow the gap and to create more equity?
So I'll just say quickly, I applaud you for bringing up that issue. I think the most hopeful note we can offer is to help Jackie revitalize the Women's City Club. And the next time you come to an event, bring 3 of your friends, because these are important conversations to be having. The school-to-prison pipeline is real. We have industrialized prison and the education system, but I won't get started on the charter movement because I don't have enough time. But listen, I'm excited that Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, is now in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. And the reason she made that decision to move from law to seminary, she said, because I realized that this is work of the soul. And so the best thing we can do is to continue to uplift this conversation. There's a new documentary coming out on Netflix that features Dr. Alexander. And let's mobilize around these traditional women's organizations. Like come on, nothing happens without the women. So let's kind of make this be something.
I'll just, as the journalist, I listen to people from all sides and, all different points of view. And I think recognizing that, that there are some commonalities that people, in terms of fighting for education reform, you have people interested in it from, all political stripes and so on. So even if there have been, and we've written a lot about some of the issues with charter schools, there's also a lot of will and interest, and we've seen, having done investigative stories about discipline issues, for example, those schools changing how they do things. And so I think that there are people who are willing and thinking and care about these issues. And so I think working across lines that people perceive and finding commonality is one way to get things done rather than attacking each other, which is what we see a lot of in education.
I feel very hopeful about young people, in as much as I could talk about the millennial generation and challenges therein. I also think that they are an incredibly conscious and socially aware and active group. And I think that they are the future and have a lot of energy and a lot of awareness about the inequalities in our world and willingness to do something about it.
I'm hopeful about you helping us, and so I agree that reviving and strengthening organizations such as this really allows people like everyone on this panel who are working in these systems to have friends, to have advocates, to have people outside of us. And I would say I'm also hopeful because when you go into a community college classroom and many classrooms in New York City, you do find extraordinary interaction, you do find interconnection, you do find the building blocks. What we have to do, as someone called it, the adults in the room, I think, is really put them together, and I think that's possible with your help.
Please give a good hand for our panelists.